Hello, everyone, and welcome back, Refocus community. My name is Barbara.
And I'm Christina.
And this week, we are talking on evil and sin. Insert evil laughter right here, Chris. Matter of fact, I'll put it. Yes, I do animations for Uprising. I'm not free. I'm not cheap. I'm not cheapo. Anyway, we finished last week our Was Jesus Really God series. And if you haven't listened to it, yeah, we had a lot of conversations that really broke our minds and are still breaking our minds.
Every day.
And this one is going to be no exception. So let's dive right in.
Right.
Did you see me dive?
Yeah, so if you're listening, you're missing Barbie's beautiful 10 out of 10 dive. And I don't know if you can continue your life without seeing it. So check us out on YouTube and have your life changed. Yeah? Let's jump into it. You were telling me about a dream you had recently.
Oh, yes. Let's start this episode with my dream, guys. I've been having a lot of dreams with snakes. And this is very interesting because I read a book on dreams, and we will eventually do an episode on dreams. And it's a very interesting topic in general, just the significance and the way of interpreting dreams. And so anyhow, what I have experienced since I have come close to this topic is now for my own self, that I have like this bits and pieces of my life where I like dream about a particular thing for a couple times and then a particular thing a couple times. So initially it was like planes. Right, very common. And snakes is also something very common, actually.
It is.
But my particular dream recently that we're gonna segue right into it was of me. I was with my mom, my sister, and my beloved dog, and her name is Philly. And we were on like some type of vacation. It was like this hotel. And so I probably like had seen the movie Encanto recently after having this dream because it was very similar to it. I opened this door of the hotel and like this forest came out and we're going to like the Amazon forest. So yeah, like there was a segue into a forest and we were all walking very happily into what seemed like a day trip in the middle of the forest, and then everybody falls because there's like a slide and everybody starts going crazy because they were all falling into not knowing where, and eventually a snake pops up and the snake chose the most vulnerable member. No, it was not me, it was my dog. So it starts strangling my dog and I get very anxious, not only in the dream but in real life, because if you're not aware, the dream in your subconscious not only affects your conscious and your mind, but your physical body's feeling the repercussions of that stress as well, right? Which is why we sweat and why we have all this anxiety upon waking up after having a dream that displeased us. And so that's how the dream ended, because immediately after that happened, I woke up and I was like, and that's exactly how I woke up. Thank God I sleep on my own. And so I started reflecting upon having this dream because I was like, whoa, that felt very full of symbols, of significances, of a lot of hidden messages that I had to reflect and ponder upon. And so I started researching about the two only ways that a snake can kill any type of living creature. And one is strangling, right? So it suffocates you through its circular body and it tangles around you and it gets the air out of you until you stop breathing. And the other way is it infects you with its venom, right? And it's a death that happens within the inside out. And I found this fascinating because we, within the Christian context, understand the whole symbolism of sin through the image of a snake, through a animal that God created, right? But we chose to portray it as evil. And I've heard this preached before, that in the same way that the snake can kill you, in the two ways that it can kill a living creature is the same way that, quote unquote, the enemy can attack a believer, right? It can either strangle you, not physically, but it can throw a bunch of lies to you until you feel like you're suffocating and you can no longer breathe. And the other alternative way to kill you is that it infects its venom, its lies. It affects you with points of view, mentalities that you might not have on your own, but it starts to feel like you have all these thoughts that are not yours until you eventually want to get a way out of things. And this got me thinking a whole lot more on evil and sin. And I'll pose a question to stop talking up on my dream, and I'll let Chris do the reaction with this question. Is evil part of us, or is it an external force?
With the message from the preacher about sin, was it sin or was it the enemy, quote unquote? We probably would do an episode about Satan and that whole thing. But let's say enemy, whatever you see that being. So it can attack us externally or internally. Externally being, because the reason I'm trying to clarify is because they sounded like the same to me. Mm-hmm. Where it's just, you're on the one end, you're being fed lies that are suffocating. And on the other end, you're being fed lies, but they become your reality. Are those the two differences of the attack of the enemy?
The way that this preacher made the difference between the two was that the second one, there's a lot of whole different ways through people, through ourselves, through external factors that can inject venom into a human being. So like the typical way that Christian churches say is that I'll show you who you are, but show me who you hang out with, right? Not just church, but that's a saying, right? Yeah. Proverbs probably has some type of verse confirming something similar, is that you are affected and you eventually become what you surround yourself with. So this is a second of injecting venom, and it's an external force. And this first one is everything that happens in the battlefield of this thing right here, right? The mind, which is why the question is so interesting to ponder, because we'll talk about original sin, we'll talk about where sin originated, but this whole idea, from my understanding, what I understood as evil is what I was told is that it's everything that the enemy throws at me. There's nothing that I can do except pray. But there's a lot of things that your own mind does on its own, from scenarios, family trauma, environments, situations, things irrelevant, like watching a movie like Encanto and then having the dream, like the one that I had where I open a door and going into the forest. There's a lot of other things that happen psychologically within the human body that we cannot just throw it out and be like, that's a devil right there. Rebuke him.
Yes. So that segues beautifully into my answer of your question. Is evil a part of us or an external force? Why does it have to be either or? Because in the question, it makes it seem like we are not part of our environment. They're like, it's us or it's in or out. I get what you mean. Is it from within or is it from external? But I don't think there's a clear distinction of where I stop and the external begins. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Especially because we are human beings created through our social context, right? There's no way that we can develop without being defined by the things that surround us.
So
and that's just life.
Right. In that case, evil is, and then I am as well. And everything. This is going to sound so new age. I apologize.
You were going great, Socrates.
I don't think there's like a distinction. I'm not saying I'm evil, obviously. I hope I'm not evil. But I don't think I stop and then evil begins, and then you stop, and then evil begins. I don't think that's how all of that works.
Yeah. It's true that it's not black and white for sure. And also with this conversation, I was thinking, when I was reflecting upon this topic, is kind of like, why? Well, number one, does evil, if God created everything, belong also to God? And two, did God also, obviously, God did create the snake. So why did he put it as an option in the first place? And the obvious answer is freedom of choice.
Yeah.
But the not so obvious answer, I'll go for it. You gonna say something?
No, I was gonna comment on something else, but no. What is the not so
Go
obvious answer?
comment. Okay, the not so common answer for me is that I learned, I took a study on Hebrew, and particularly of God's name. God's several names in the Bible, in Hebrew and their direct translation and their ways of being interpreted to modern English and our modern language. And one of them being Jehovah, and the literal translations and the syllables and the letters. And anyhow, so according to these translators and theologians, is Jehovah's name means to cause to become. Cause to become. And this teaching
So
drove
it's a
me
verb?
crazy because it's a verb. It's a verb. It's not only a verb, it demands a whole lot of action too. So yeah, not just a noun. Honestly, it got me thinking. It's also an adjective. It's also a, because if you think about it, there's a lot of things that have to happen when something becomes something, and there has to be with this idea is right, quote unquote, one could say Ephesians 4:22, that Paul says we gotta put off the old man and we gotta like remove all these evil inclinations to be able to hear God more clearly, and to kind of like, I have to do all these things on my own so that I can understand God better and I can get closer to God. And in reality, there's nothing you can't do without God causing you to become. So the closer that I get to God, the closer that I get to being the person that he wants me to be, because being closer to him causes an action within me that causes me to become something that I was not. So let's break that down, because that sounded a whole lot of
Yep. I was
a
lost.
whole
I
lot
don't
of
know
blah
why.
blah 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 blah. Because listen, this is what I mean related to the dream. This is why I'm gonna tie it all up. It is, why did God create the snake and put it for Eve and Adam in the first place in the garden? Demonstrated not just to be a God that can protect you, because obviously God could protect Adam and Eve from the evilness in the snake, but also he's a God of preparation. And it is what this statement of cause to become means, that if there must be something that I am not right now, means that there is something else that I can be better at in preparation for something. And if having to choose between being shielded from reality and being like, oh no, Adam and Eve, you guys are gonna work with me, oh, we're gonna live all here forever, you guys are gonna be vegan and everything, be naked forever, you're not gonna wear none of this boring clothes that's itchy and everything, and versus having to push them towards building something else. Obviously Adam and Eve not in that context, because it wasn't his original intent for evil, or was it, question mark? But versus pushing us as human beings today for something else, for a stronger character. I think in the God that I understand, I would choose to believe in a God that pushes for the latter and not the first, from being shielded from reality, if that makes sense. Because it comes down to the concept of suffering, whether I want to achieve something, but I'm not capable, or I'm not interested in doing the suffering, but I do want to get there, so I might as well suck up the suffering. I'm gonna pause so that I can rephrase anything that didn't make sense, because Chris, you're looking a little confused, and I'm willing to reiterate and re-explain anything that did not make sense.
Gotcha. I'm gonna repeat to you what I think I heard, and then give my own take, because from what I think I heard, I don't know if I agree, or I don't know if I see the origin story in that light. What I think I heard is this. Well, number one, I don't believe that the origin story was an actual occurrence, but that's besides the point. But even in the metaphorical sense, what I'm hearing is, in this instance, God allowed the snake, created one and allowed the snake to be in the garden as a way of exposing Adam and Eve to the realities of reality, I guess, realities of existence. And that includes evil. And in doing that, what I think you are saying, in doing that, God prepares them to be able to combat the evil. I'm not, that's where I fell off.
This is why I want to put it in another scenario, because
Gotcha.
I think it doesn't make sense a lot when we put it in the Adam story. Only kind of like the first part, right? But not if we think of, let's say I'm going through the most famous question within Christian context: why does bad stuff happen to good people?
Mm-hmm.
Why, if I have done everything right under God's eyes, am I going through this situation?
Mm-hmm.
It makes more sense when I think about it, that whether I prefer to believe that, or do I want to see a change after the situation, or do I want to be shielded and protected but stay in my same place within the situation? Like, because the only way that we can grow is through trials, is through imbalances, is through challenges. And that's just life, even though it sucks. But there's no other way for us to see something else. And that's why this whole Jehovah's name is interesting to ponder of, is like, does God willingly take us into uncomfortable places with a goal in mind to see transformation? And
Right.
what does that mean?
I think that I agree. That makes sense, right? But I don't think it makes sense in the origin story.
No, not Adam and Eve. Not Adam and Eve. No, we were just transitioning. So that was.
Okay. I missed the transition because in the Adam and Eve story, God told them not to do it, right?
Yep.
So it wasn't like, do it and you'll be stronger and more faithful or whatever. It was, don't do this thing. And you mentioned it before, I think, in the story, the idea of the snake, the whole point is freedom of choice, right? Mm-hmm. And that choice comes with consequences. Whether you believe in the Bible, that the Bible is the word of God, whether you believe in God in general, you cannot disagree with the idea that action has an equal reaction. And do you want to transition into sin, or do you have anything else to say about evil? Did we even, do we feel like we,
sin.
Okay, so.
Because what even is a snake if there's no sin?
Sorry?
What even is a snake if there's no sin? What is sin?
What is sin? We can define it for ourselves, and then we can talk about how it's been defined for us growing up. I can start. Growing up, sin was tied to disobedience. Sin was tied to God told you to do X and you did Y. It wasn't really, why is Y bad? Why is Y not great for me? It was, it's like when your mom says, don't do this. Why, Mom? Because I said so. That's what it felt like. I think now I would describe sin as being any action that causes harm to yourself or to another being, right? And to bring the idea of God into it, something that we do, let me speak for myself, something that I do today that I think is inconsequential, or I think is something light, something not serious, might cause harm to myself or to somebody 20 years later. And because I am just a being that lives in the moment, I cannot see that. And so that's why I understand the idea or the concept of looking to the higher power for guidance of what is sin and what is not sin, because of my limited perspective. How would you define sin?
Period. In a very similar way. My mentality 10, 15 years ago, as a kid growing up within a Pentecostal church, that sin is only a law. Mm-hmm. And there was no thought process beyond that. There was no, there's some type of good behind being faithful. There was just do this and make sure you don't do that. And conveniently, a lot, depending where you grew up and what specific type of denomination or church or type of denomination or church you went to, a lot of these sins had a range of severity. Right? So, like, oh, you stole some rings from the mall. You slept with who? Like, there's ranges of, we have understand, like, there's these concepts like capital sin. Like, you can totally, within the Catholic Church, I don't know, do something like do a white lie, which we all do. But then you go ahead and do something else that's more severe, like cheat on your husband, and everything is like, oh no, that's a bigger sin than the other one. Like, who said that? And there was a lot of things that didn't make sense in my mind, for sure. And the whole different ways of how to even address their consequences, like nothing made sense really. As we're speaking here, in the Catholic, as for about the Catholic Church, it's also the fact that rather, I want to pose a question: is where did sin originate? Right? When does sin take place for the first time in a human being? And it's a topic that has been dissected in psychology of blank slates. Right? Are we born evil, or do we come fresh out the womb, ready to absorb anything that we are given as babies? And surprisingly, it has shown that we have a lot of evil inclinations. And the Catholic Church has corroborated and developed, what's it called? Like customs, right? Traditions out of this. The very own fact that babies within the Catholic Church are baptized for their forgiveness of the original sin and welcoming for the Catholic Church, versus non-Catholic Christian churches that baptize adult human beings when they're able to understand what a baptism even is. So, sin is evil inclination. Are we born selfish or not? What's your thought process, Chris?
I just casually asked me a philosophical question.
With a cup of tea that I do not have.
I think when you were speaking, when I was thinking about, which this is not our first take, we've had many takes. So we had a conversation prior in which we talked about the idea of the role that the way we appraise an action, how that plays into the idea of sin, right? Say let me get my thoughts together. I don't know if you've heard of these dilemmas, what's the word that I'm looking for? These thought exercises in which you hear, okay, a man steals bread. That would be a sin because stealing is a sin, according to the scripture. But he steals bread because his children are starving. Have you heard those things like that before? And so,
conditional.
Right. A big part of sin is context and appraisal. So maybe so the man steals the bread. He's being selfish because he didn't pay. He's thinking only about himself and his loved ones. So that's him being selfish. But in the same act, he's being generous. He's being brave to put himself on the line to save his family. Selfish and selfless in one act. So I think before I can even answer, are we born selfish or not, we have to think about these things. Everything is context. Everything is relative. So I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, that's so good, because you were also mentioning one, that every action has a reaction, right? And it's the question that follows this one is what does it mean when we reconsider what is good and what is bad, and who it benefits? Because immediately as you brought that example up, and the very own fact that we are comparing sin as to being laws, which in the same way we have laws to follow as citizens in whichever country that you reside in. In the same way, if you follow a religion, there's certain things that you're expected to follow to become and be welcomed as a member of the religion. And that, in essence, is what sin is, right? Whether you are being obedient in your faith or not. And this determines what type of believer you are, sadly. Because if you disobey, you are lukewarm and you are rejected in many of them, or looked down upon, even worse. Anyway, the question that follows that is whether what happens, for example, speaking politically, when we think of all these migrants coming in for all types of borders, and also include the context. Say, yes, they're breaking law, and yes, they are doing a whole lot borderline, illegally. But what is the context that they're escaping from? Right? And there's nothing that we can consider in life without considering its context. There's nothing in life that we can think of with it just being black and white, which is what makes loss and sin itself so intricate, so difficult. That's what makes politics so difficult. This is why it makes religion so difficult. This is probably why we separate politics and religion.
Yeah.
It hurts.
Yeah, I think that essence of what you've just said is my gripe with religions in general. Like the idea, we're going to talk about being saved in a future episode, but there are some denominations of the church, right, that talk about if you say these words, right, doesn't matter if you're a good person, whatever that means, or a bad person, if you have not accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior and know him as this denomination knows him, then it's bye-bye for you. You're separated from God forever. And it goes back to that black and white aspect of it, right? Everything we experience is not dualistic, right? It's like what I was talking about with evil before. It's not this evil exists here but not there, but like everything is connected. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but my point was the notion of things like being X or Y is very hard for me. Now, does that mean it's wrong? No, it might just mean I need to suck it up and make my peace with it. Yeah, I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, religion would tell you that you have to make a decision whether you want to be in or you want to be out.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, if you want to have to follow the law in a country, you either do it or you don't, or you're out.
That's true.
Or
maybe that's just the way it is.
And you're put in a jail, literally, because you break the law. And
Oh,
depends
Lord.
what law you break. But we're going to continue this conversation, like Chris said, on what happens when you break that law within the church and outside the church. And yep, that's why the big dude came out as a human. Jesus came in for that sin, right? So what happens when we commit that sin? Obviously, yes, we spoke about the crucifixion, and what that means and what that entails, but we're gonna talk more about next episode of that dilemma between mercy and justice, because although we know God to be a merciful and forgiving God, he has also, not only in the Old Testament, but through Jesus' sacrifice, shown to be a God that demands and expects some type of sacrifice, right? And some type of suffering and some type of for letting go of oneself to be more like God. And that's a conversation for next time. Tune in. We'll see you here. Episodes
I want to interject
Sunday.
very quickly. Sorry, I know we're trying to end, but I feel like we kind of glossed over something major when we were talking
What?
about evil. The question of if God is everything. Because can God exist outside of reality? One, if God cannot exist outside of reality and evil exists in this reality, does evil exist? And this is blasphemous, I know, but I'm going to ask it because this is the point of the podcast. Does evil exist within God? I don't have an answer, but did you have anything else to add on that? I just feel like we kind of glossed over that.
We Okay, so pose the question again for me, please. Does
Let me
evil also belong to God? Because God did also create the snake.
And even in the stories, like the snake didn't just appear out of nowhere, right? So, can God create something? Like, can God create something that does not exist within itself? Right? So we're agreeing, I guess, in the story that God created evil. But how can God create evil if God does not contain evil? I don't have an answer, but that's the question.
Yeah. Well, technically, evil created itself through its human characteristics, which were made by God. Because
But evil
if you
can't
think about
create;
it,
only God can create.
it's true. That's true. Right? It can only influence, but it did. What I'm trying to say is that, like, if we take it to the story form, right? Lucifer, created by God to worship God, becomes full of himself, egoistic, selfish, and eventually ditches the whole kingdom deal and develops his own. And that's what we understand and know as evil and are presented in it at first through a snake in a garden, right? Christian context, theology. And technically, he didn't create himself, but his choices did have the influence into what he created. So I there's a question that comes. My answer is gonna be a question,
Yeah.
right? Here at Refocus, that's what we do. Is if God can create evil, then can our
Try it. It's okay. Take your time.
Let me
Take your
post
time.
it another way. Let me post
Yeah.
it another way, because that way it wasn't gonna be as effective as this way. Can we? Can he? If he can't create, he can only influence. Can we, in the same way, create through our decisions? Like, for example, he wasn't able to create. He was able only to influence, but he created out of his influence. What happens when we are able to influence so drastically to a certain extent that it creates something bigger than us that not only belongs to us? Because evil started as, quote unquote, a disobedience, an idea outside of God, an idea to exist outside of God, an idea to compete and destroy God, right? Which is what we're told is the aim of evil. But if it didn't create itself, it was created through its influences, through its God-given ability to be selfish. Like, are we then, if we're able to be selfish because God allowed us to be selfish, question mark?
But even in the court, like, can something exist outside of God? Can God be here and then something be outside of God? Then what is this space? That is what that's. I guess that some people believe that is hell, to be outside of God. But I feel like that makes me uncomfortable to have to think that there's a space that's outside of God. Sorry, I derailed this when we were trying to
make that
end.
conversation happen. We'll make that conversation happen.
My bad.
If you have questions and you have answers, let us know. Can evil exist outside of God? Technically. Anyway, here at Focus, we always end with questions, never with answers, because life is a quest and an unfiltered search for meaning. Let us know how you find that this week. Reach us out through social media, and we'll see you next week.